Games. Shooty McBang Bang. Propaganda. Maybe a zombie? Welcome to Thrack Ops. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to episode 2 of Call of Duty Thrack Ops, where I, Thrack, will be guiding you through the entire Call of Duty franchise, hopefully picking out the good from the bad. Thanks, everybody who listened to episode 1 and episode 0, for that matter. I greatly appreciate it. This podcast is part of the Superpod Network. So if you are unfamiliar, you can go to superpodnetwork.com, where there is a host of amazing podcasts about video games. There's the Superpod Saga, Super Ghost Radio, Fine Time, Bar Silence, my other show, The 3DO Experience, among many others. So if you enjoy this show, please go to that website because there is more greatness there for you to listen to. Today, we are looking at the first Call of Duty on consoles, Call of Duty Finest Hour. It was released on November 16th, 2004 for the PlayStation 2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. I imagine for a lot of people my age, this was one of their first, the first time they saw Call of Duty. I used to go to the rental store every weekend, and looking through all the games, I've seen the cover of Finest Hour. I remember seeing it. I never rented it at the time. Something about it just didn't really catch me. I think it was just the era of World War II first-person shooters. It was so hot, and there were so many of them that it felt like it was just going to fade into the background like anything else. So this is actually my first time playing the game start to finish is on this show. So you'll be getting a fresh experience for me with this one. I did own a copy of it for the GameCube back in the day. Played a little bit of it. Didn't think much of it. But I bought a copy on the original Xbox for this show, so that is the version that I played. I played it backwards compatible on the Xbox 360. It does have a weird glitch on it, where it's near the end of the Russian campaign where you're on the tanks. For some reason, there's a spot where the game will just freeze. But if you knock the resolution down to, I think it's like 480p, it'll clear right through, and then you can bump back up to 1080p. That's a very weird glitch, but I figured I'd just let you know if anybody was interested in playing it that way. It emulates fairly well on the PlayStation 2, on the PCSX2, which is the PlayStation 2 emulator, Dolphin for the GameCube emulator. I did not check the OG Xbox emulator, XEMU, but I know that one is still being worked on. So, and yeah, as far as I know, this game never got an official PC port, because this was meant to be a consoleized version of Call of Duty 1, but it ended up just being a spin-off due to the vast differences that are here. And it was developed by a company named Spark Unlimited, who, when I was doing my research for this episode, Spark Unlimited had much more of an interesting story than I imagined. And hopefully I do my best to detail everything that happened to them, because I'm going to kind of... They were a short-lived developer, so I think I can do my best to kind of give a rough overview of what happened to their situation. Spark Unlimited were formed in March of 2002 by former members of EA who had worked on the Medal of Honor series. Similar to Infinity Ward, they went to Activision to make a deal to develop games for them, and that deal was struck to make multiple games for them, and Call of Duty Finest Hour was the first one. But they immediately hit a snag, because EA ended up suing them, accusing them of stealing like source code, art, and development software. EA noticed that it was about like 20 or so devs quit about the same time, so they thought it was a little bit fishy. So that's why they ended up taking them to court. The case got settled in early 2003, but because it was later on, Activision had to foot the bill on the settlement, because the settlement was they just paid each other's legal fees. So because Activision had already made the deal with Spark, they had to foot the bill, which I think did not create goodwill almost immediately. But once they got to working on the game, development issues just became a problem almost immediately, because Spark was created with this idea of not making their own like tools. They were just using a lot of like pre-made tools and game engines and things like that, so that they could focus more on the creative side of game development, which seems a lot like what game developers do these days. Like they'll just use Unity or Unreal or whatever, right? So Spark kind of had this idea at the time because they were like, oh, we should just use Renderware as the game engine for our game. Renderware was very, very popular at the time, used on a lot of games in this era. If you play any game from the PS2, Xbox, GameCube era, you'll notice a lot of like just Renderware splash screens. So it was, as I said, very popular at the time. And the original Call of Duty, I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but it was made on the id Tech 3 engine, which I think is why it lended so well to first-person shooters. And then Infinity Ward took the id Tech 3 engine, like the tools and stuff, and then ended up creating their own engine called the IW. But we'll get to that next time. But this game, as I said, it was using Renderware, and the developers were not used to Renderware, so that created problems. They had organizational issues, which lasted them their entire history, really. I imagine running a new studio like this is going to not be breezy. Like, it's going to be a challenge. But unfortunately, it was a challenge they could never really, get away with or figure out, is what I meant to say. And then Activision had different progress expectations on them compared to Electronic Arts. Because back when they were at EA, they said that they would just kind of let them make it at their own pace. And like when they got to certain progress points in the game development, then they would show EA what they had. But Activision was like giving them like strict deadlines and being like, you have to have a playable version of this on a disc by this time. And so the developers were not used to that, and that caused even more issues. And this caused Activision to step in and assist. Like they brought in some of their own engineers to help get the game across the finish line, and they even outsourced development of the Xbox and the GameCube versions of the games to Kuju. Helped out with the Xbox version of the port, and Exact Entertainment I think just developed the GameCube port entirely. So, yeah. The game was originally going to come out in, I think it was like mid to late 2003, maybe even early 2004, but it ended up getting delayed up until, as I said, November 2004, and the game went gold about a month prior. So after the game came out, Spark pitched a new game to Activision called Call of Duty Combined Forces, but it was rejected due to Activision's concerns about their organizational issues and feeling the proposal was half-baked. And because of that, they ended up freeing Spark from any future obligations. But this caused Spark to file a lawsuit against them, claiming a breach of contract. Activision countersued, claiming that Spark had fraudulently represented themselves in their initial contract offer, and then all of the help they needed to give Spark to get Finest Hour over the finish line. They just thought that, hey, Spark was acting very unprofessionally, and then them suing Activision over this because Spark was demanding like a $500,000 fee to let the contract go. It got ugly, like, fairly quickly. And even during the court proceedings, Spark claimed that Activision had stole the ideas that it had for Combined Forces to make a game called Call of Duty 2 Big Red 1, which was developed by Treyarch and Grey Matter. But I'll discuss that when we get to that game's episode, so I won't go too far into that. But the lawsuit was eventually settled. As far as I could tell, it was settled out of court. In my research, I wasn't able to find any sort of exact details about when the court case ended, but I'm assuming it wasn't too long after this. So later on, Spark, they signed contracts with companies like Atari, Sierra, and Codemasters to develop games for them after this. So Spark would create... They create a handful of games after this. They made Turning Point Fall of Liberty. I remember seeing this game. It's one of those games that I always saw at the rental store, but I never played. A game called Legendary, which I'm not familiar with at all. They made Lost Planet 3, which I think is the Lost Planet game people don't like. And then they ended their career with Yaba Ninja Gaiden Z, which I have, but I've never really played. But then they closed down in 2015. And there were claims of Activision trying to kill Spark, or that Spark kind of framed it as, with the lawsuit and everything, that like Activision was trying to kill them off for some reason. I find these claims kind of baseless, in my opinion. Spark came off to me as a developer who wanted to coast on the success of console first-person shooters at the time. Like, they were there for, a lot of those devs were there for the early Medal of Honor success, and I think saw that the genre was going to explode, and they just kind of wanted to, like, be their own developer and kind of, reap the rewards, not working directly under EA. But I just really don't think they were that talented enough to really make it work, because you can claim that, like, Activision hurt you, but when a good chunk of your development history, or your history as a studio, is based more on, like, lawsuits and litigation and, these big publishers claiming you did really sneaky things, and then your defense is it's almost baseless in a way. It's just easy for you to come off as the bad guy, I tend to support the developer most of the time, but from what I've read of this situation, I think Spark were in the wrong. I'll put my sources that I found of all the litigation stuff in the description of the podcast if you want to have a look for yourself. Because, it is a surprisingly interesting history. But yeah, in my opinion, I just don't think they were as talented enough as Infinity Ward to be blunt, I guess. Because does Finest Hour hold up? I mean, you can kind of call it Call of Duty Middest Hour. Yeah, it's kind of mid. It's not very good. There are things about the game that I think work, but then I think for the most part, I just don't think it really does work. It's one of those games that I could see in its era being fairly solid, but playing it by, like, modern standards, I just don't think it really holds up. Like, Call of Duty 1 had its issues as far as, like, aging, right? But I think Call of Duty 1 aged far better than this game did. But I'll get into that once I start talking about, like, the gameplay and everything. But before we do that, let's take a quick little break, and then we'll talk about the story. The story for this game is it follows similar beats to Call of Duty 1 with the Americans, British, and Soviet campaigns, but it doesn't follow them beat by beat. It kind of tells its own little tale. So here we start with the Soviets, where we first play as Private Alexander Sokolov in the Battle of Stalingrad. From there, we move to other Russian soldiers, such as female sniper Tanya Pavlovna, I hope I said that right, and Major Nikolai Badanov, who participates in Operation Little Saturn, which was a Soviet assault on the German airfield in Tatiskaya? Kaya? I don't know. My Russian's terrible. The gameplay here ranges from your typical on-the-ground shooting to raiding enemy fortresses, using your sniper skills to protect tanks, and eventually driving your own tank, blowing up other tanks and airplanes in the said airfield battle. From there, we move to the British campaign, which takes place in North Africa for this time, which would be a bit of a running theme for future Call of Duty games. But here we play as Edward Carlisle. You start off doing a night raid in Tunisia, and then you end up getting into a jeep, shooting a bunch of enemies with a machine gun there, and then raiding a temple of sorts to rescue a British officer. The British campaign here is fairly short. The Russian campaign, I think, has like 8 or so chapters, whereas the British campaign only has 4. But here we end with the American campaign as Sergeant Chuck Walker capturing the city of Aachen, Germany, while protecting tanks. You eventually get to command a tank later on, but this time as Tank Commander Sam Rivers, who's our first black playable character in the series. But later on, you return to Chuck in order to get the tanks out of a hole, take over a bridge, and just further push into Germany. The story here is about it's fairly kind of one note as far as like Call of Duty 1 was concerned. I think Call of Duty 1 had a bit of a bigger emphasis on trying to have more genuine character connections, whereas here the story feels very, if you've played, I don't know, Medal of Honor Frontline or Medal of Honor Rising Sun, where the story feels like it just kind of takes a back seat to everything. But there are some good, cool moments in there. Like, as I said, you play as a female sniper in the Soviet campaign, which is really cool. A black character who's a tank commander is also really interesting. And it tries to follow its own kind of beats, because even though this was meant to be a consoleized version of Call of Duty 1, it just kind of really is its own thing. And I don't know if that was really the intention, or as they were developing it, it just kind of became its own thing, I guess. But, the story just really, I don't know, there's just not really that much there that's worth talking about, I guess. I don't know. Some of you may disagree, and that's fair, but I think a lot of these early World War II Call of Duties, they just don't have a strong emphasis on story, because you're constantly swapping between all these different characters and these different scenarios and situations that I think it's difficult to really make any sort of emotional connections or follow sort of any like deep character arcs with any of these campaigns. So they just end up feeling kind of hollow, really, and nothing really sticks out, unfortunately. The one thing that really stuck out for me, though, was there are these little cinematic third-person cutscenes that happen, which is very unique for the series. I don't think it really appears anywhere else, because later, I know when we get to more of the Treyarch games, when they do cutscenes, they tend to still retain the first-person view, so you still, but they'll, letterbox everything. Here, the camera pans around, you see, your character, but it'll, pan around and give you more of, a cinematic look. Like in the opening of the game, when you're the Soviets, you're on that boat heading to shore, and it just kind of slowly zooms in on your character sitting there on the boat, which is a really nice touch. And then, say you, as Alexander, you meet Tanya in that opening fortress mission, and then later on you get to play as her. They try their best to have more of those sort of connections there, but we never explore these characters in any sort of deep way. But that was kind of the common thing back then with shooters. Most shooters didn't really have deep, intricate storylines. I think the closest we had at the time was probably Halo, I think. Because looking back, Doom didn't really have a story. Quake may have. I haven't played really that much of Quake, but it's more of just par for the course, I guess. Though it won't be too long until we actually have more detailed story and characters. So I'll try to get more into detail when I get to them. Because I know I didn't cover a lot of the story in the last game, and that's just because there wasn't a huge amount of stuff there. And even here, some ways there's less of it. It tries to be more interesting, but I think it just ends up not being anything that memorable as far as the story goes. But this is a shooter game, so it's more about the gameplay. So how does the gameplay fare? This game feels a lot closer to Medal of Honor than Call of Duty 1 does. I've played later Infinity Ward Call of Duty games, and making that connection from 1 to 2 even is fairly easy to make, but Finest Hour really sticks out. I think it's going to be sort of the ugly duckling of the series, because this was the only game made by Spark, and it clearly shows that they just, as I had said before, were not as good at making these games as Infinity Ward or even, say, Treyarch later on down the road. Graphically, I mean, if I showed you a screenshot of this game, I don't think you would think it's a Call of Duty game. I don't think people would say that, like the game's very gray. It's very like gray and brown, not a lot of color, which it's easy to get away with that because it's a war game, So there's a lot of like, broken down buildings and rubble and explosions and everything. So it's not a very colorful scene, sure, but it just, I don't know. It reminds me a little bit of, say, like the Resistance games, where it's just a little bit drab to look at, I think. Michael Giacchino returns to do the score as he had done in the first game. I think I said his name wrong last time, but now I know it's Michael Giacchino. And yeah, he does another stellar job with the score. And actually later on would do the soundtrack for Turning Point Fall of Liberty. So I guess he must have had a good time with Spark. I guess somebody had to, right? I remember last time I complained a little bit about the controls of the original, but I think it was more, I was forcing a PC game to play like a console game. Here, it is a console game, so I don't really have to worry about that. And the controls they're okay. The sensitivity of like aiming everywhere is really slow. You only have 3 options: low, medium, and high. And I put it at medium because high was just a little bit too fast for me. Like you kind of zip around a little bit. So medium, it was fairly sluggish, but it was doable. And then certain things, certain things that like you're used to with the modern Call of Duty games just isn't really here. Like RB isn't grenade. Like B crouches, but then Y stands you back up. If you want to switch weapons, it's one of the buttons on the D-pad. It was still they hadn't standardized the controls yet kind of a thing. But, I mean, it was fine. It was nothing really amazing. I did have some issues with lighting. Now, I was playing this backwards compatible on the 360. Like, I was trying to play it on my OG Xbox, but the game would keep crashing, saying the disc was dirty or damaged. But I would look at the disc, and it was perfectly fine. I've had this issue with a couple of other Xbox games I've had, so it could just be my disk drive and my OG Xbox is going out. I'm not sure. I need to look into that. So I went ahead and played it on the 360, and for some reason on the 360, it was really dark, like as far as lighting goes. Like there were certain moments where I could barely see anything. It just looked like a black screen. I did everything I could to adjust the brightness because there's no brightness adjustment within the game. I just tried it on my TV, but it seemed to not help as much as I would have liked to. So there were some moments where I was literally shooting into like pitch black. I don't know why that was the case for this game, but I don't know. It made the game difficult in certain spots because the difficulty of this game is kind of all over the place. Like the early, like the Russian campaign is, I would say, fairly easy. It was actually kind of, I don't want to say a cakewalk, but it was kind of breezy to play through the whole thing with very little resistance, I think. The only issues that came into play were, say, like the tank missions, where you have like your first-person view of the tank, which is really cool, but then it would switch to a third-person view, which was like, oh, I like that, the third-person view. But the controls for it were, something was off. Like there was a little reticule where you could aim where to shoot the tank, like where the tank shell would come out, but it would like aim slightly above it. I could never actually destroy anything in third-person view. And then if you went one above that, you could just sit on top of the tank and shoot everything with your gun, which I like that they added that, but it felt completely superfluous. So I just went back to the first person because you could actually aim and shoot things. And that mission where you're in the airfield, you're blowing up tanks and down planes and rocket launcher guys and all that is pretty cool. But then there would be certain moments where you would get sort of hit with a rocket launcher out of the blue. And you'd just be like, what the fuck? What? Get out of here, man. So it would just have those little difficulty moments. But as I said, the Soviet campaign was fairly tolerable. But it's when we get to like the British and the American campaigns where things get much, much harder, unfortunately. And some of that problem lies in the same issues I had with Call of Duty 1, which was the health and the checkpoint system. So this game does not have regenerating health either. It has a health bar. It's much better about the health bar than the first game. You can actually take more hits. There's much more health packs, health drops throughout the game, and you can even find like bigger med kits to sort of like you can take with you, which is something the first game really needed, just like an ability to have 3 or 4 of them at your disposal that you could just use whenever you need to. And this game does that, which definitely helps. But the further in the game you get, the harder and harder it is to find health packs. And so once again, there would be stretches where I would just be dying all the time due to lack of health and trying my best to, clear the path, but I really couldn't. And it has a checkpoint system, and the checkpoint system is decently generous. It's more generous than the first game, but you can't save whenever you want. So if you die at a certain point, you just have to kind of deal with it. But really where this game bothers me is in some of the shooting, right? Like the guns, they feel worse than the the first Call of Duty. But as I had said before, in this era, I don't think people were really that concerned about getting the guns feeling right, They just wanted it to be like, yeah, you just shoot shit, right? Like the tech just wasn't there yet. But this game, it feels like the shooting takes quite a step back. As far as guns go, I think you have less guns than you do in the PC version. Like you have your M1 Garand, your Thompson, your Sten, your Lee Enfield, Mosin Nagant, PPSH, all that stuff. But things like the MP44 are not here. The Euro 43, the M1A1 carbine, certain things like that aren't here at all. And the guns look and behave a little bit differently here. You still aim down the sights, which is really nice, but like the range on these guns, I wrote down gun range is piss poor. And they are. Like, even with a rifle, like there will be times where you'll like clearly see an enemy. Like say he's at a machine gun, like a couple 100 yards down the road. And it feels like in any other Call of Duty game, I would shoot him and take him down. But here, nothing. And then the gunner would just start shooting me and actually be able to hit me, which didn't make any sense to me. And these enemies are just the worst kind of bullet sponges. But I think the bullet sponge issue that's in this game, it's almost reflective of like the animations and almost like canceling animations, because a lot of enemies have very exaggerated death animations when you kill them, but it takes so long and sometimes they'll like kind of wobble and act kind of funny that you'll think that they're like not dying or they're doing like the fake out thing, so you'll shoot them again, but then it's almost like you cancel the animation and then they just come back and start shooting you. It's just it's really excessive for no reason, and a lot of the gunplay here feels like excessive for no reason. And while the enemy AI I think is much better tooled in this compared to Call of Duty 1, like they don't laser focus on you with pinpoint accuracy, they can still be too good at their shooting than you think they should be. And because it's not like a super fast-paced game, it can make some of those more hairier situations kind of become a problem. And then, there's moments where it's like you go through sewers because, of course, there's fucking dreaded sewer. There's multiple sewer levels in this. I hate sewer levels in games. I think a lot of people do. Like, why does every fucking game need to have some kind of sewer level? It's so stupid. And, like, because they're gross. They're never really that interesting to play as far as, like, level design or aesthetics. Like, unless you're the Ninja Turtles, I have no interest in going into the sewers. And this game does it multiple times. And it tries to do the whole, like, oh, if we go into the sewers, we can, go around the Nazis and flank them. But you never fucking do. They always seem to find you at the end of it anyway. So there's really no point. There are many chunks of the game where it almost turns into, like, a corridor shooter. One thing I could give Call of Duty 1 credit for was it having more of like an open air type of feeling, like these kind of like big fields. Finest Hour just doesn't do that. It could just be that the technology that they were using at the time wasn't capable of handling that type of combat. You do have some like open air moments, but they're nothing really that special or spectacular. And it just ends up becoming more of like a corridor shooter than anything else, and that was like kind of disappointing, really. I just found this game overall to be like disappointing. When I first started playing it, I was like, oh, this isn't too bad. This is kind of neat. But the further in I got, the problems just kind of arose, and it got to a point where I was just kind of not enjoying it by the end of the game, and just kind of squeaked it out at the end. I'm sure there are people who have fond memories of this game back in the day, and I'm not going to begrudge those people, but for me, it just wasn't it, man. It just doesn't have that special sauce that like a Call of Duty 1 has. You know, like I wasn't too high on Call of Duty 1, but playing this game made me appreciate it a little bit more. If anything, it made me appreciate how competent Infinity Ward are as developers and how they would improve so drastically in their next couple games. And Spark never really got that chance, which is a shame when you think about it. It would have been interesting to see what they would have done had they gotten another shot at it, but apparently their pitch, as I had said before, was just completely shot down. And bits of it have leaked online. It didn't really seem that interesting. Like, the most controversial part about it was it had like a Russian soldier who was like a little bit of like a schizophrenic, which could have been an interesting gameplay trope to explore, like the mind of a soldier in like a war who's like, you know, dealing with like mental illness. You know, like that's an interesting concept. But if I recall correctly, the Call of Duty series would actually study that idea in future entries. But we're not going to get there quite yet, unfortunately. So yeah, this is a bit of a short one again. I was hoping that there would be a little bit more as far as like content out of this one was concerned, but there just wasn't a whole lot there, really. But I think it just kind of represents that the series was just in a very sort of like a fetal stage. You know, it hadn't really discovered itself yet. But as we go on later on, the series will absolutely find themselves, and there will be plenty more to talk about. Any historical inaccuracy stuff? I mean, you know, there's some nitpicky stuff that isn't really there, but I think as far as like story beats and the way they look at the various campaigns and all that, it's nothing too egregious. It's not like the glaring problem that's in Call of Duty 1 or some of the problems that would appear later in the series. It's just fairly kind of, I guess, what you expect. Like, is it accurate? Probably not, but you know, it just kind of is what it is. And this kind of boils down to just being another run-of-the-mill World War II shooter from this era, of which there were plenty. We weren't short of them at the time, so that must have been why I was never really that interested in this game at the time, even when there was praise being stacked onto the game in this series, but it just wasn't enough for me. I wouldn't jump into the series until a little bit after this. So, if any of you are curious, its Metacritic stands now in the mid-70s. So the PS2 version has a 76, the GameCube a 74, and the Xbox a 73, which denotes like generally favorable mixed or average reviews, and I think that's fair. It's a game that it just sticks out in the Call of Duty franchise due to its unique developer, due to its unique circumstances, and due to it just kind of not fitting into the overall canon that the series would create for itself. So forgettable. Forgettable. I'm gonna be bold and say this game is forgettable. But that's the way it goes sometimes. So, but that's gonna do it for Call of Duty Finest Hour. So thanks everyone for listening. Make sure to like, rate, star, review, share. Did I miss any? There might be something I missed. Who knows? But do all that stuff. Let's try to get this show out to as many people as possible, so that I want to hear your thoughts on it. So please let me know. I am at Blue Sky at Thrack. I'll put other social link stuff in the social media links in the description. So if you want to give me any comments, that would be nice. Thank you. Next time we'll be covering a personal favorite of mine, and that is Call of Duty 2. So until then, guys, bye-bye.